Welcome to Notes in the Margin, a discussion with authors about their recent work. Notes in the Margin is sponsored by Off the Beaten Path Bookstore and Cafe in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. I'm Mike Skov. My wife Danielle and I own Off the Beaten Path, and we welcome you. This episode is a discussion with Eugene Buchanan, a Steamboat local who has written his sixth book, Yampa Yearnings, an ode to one of the last wild rivers in the West. Welcome, Eugene. Let's get started. One of the many things I loved about this book is that you covered everything, like, the chapter on fish, the chapter on birds, the chapter on animals.
There was still stuff I didn't, that I didn't really do. This thing ended up being pretty, somewhat of a beast, long. I had to go through and, the first draft, I was like, oh my God, all right, this is too long, because I kind of gave it to the printer to see what it would come in at, and I was like, oh my God, 400 and whatever pages, I can't do that, let's jack up the margin, let's do what we can with the font size, but then I got to go through and start and hack it out,
right?
Just because I didn't want this thing to be I wanted it to be digestible, and even that's still a pretty good sized book,
Right. Another thing I liked so much about this book is that, of course, we learn about the Yampa and how important it is to Steamboat and the Yampa Valley and all points west of here. Mm-hmm. But we learn so much about you, too. And your chapter about the Boulder childhood was awesome. I mean, it made me so nostalgic for the 1970s and growing up in that era. But I'm curious if writing about yourself, which I imagine you did more of that in this book than you have in any of your previous books, what some of the challenges are for having to be vulnerable.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, one thing I tried to do with this book is I wanted to make it readable. I wanted people to be as entertained by it as educated by it. Because if you can, water is a relatively dry topic, like I think I mentioned in there. And so I wanted to kind of inject my own personal kind of relationship with it, with the Yampa, how I came to be here and live along its banks and move to Steamboat. And so as part of that, I felt like, all right, I have to talk about a little bit of my background, like how I got into river running and that sort of thing. And, it wasn't a real romantic start, grew up in Boulder where all we had was those little front range manky creeks like Boulder Creek. And my friend and I, Robbie, he just called me actually last night. So it's the first time I talked to him in a while. And we would just take to Boulder Creek in these inner tubes day after day. And back then that Boulder Creek ran more than it does these days in climate change. It had water in it all the time. We got our butts kind of handed to us, but the school of hard rocks, I think I called it.
Right. And do you think, if you were to write a book entirely about growing up in the 70s in Boulder, in your case, would it have more water in it than the average person's? Or
probably not. Maybe a little bit, just because we gravitated to Boulder Creek, but Boulder wasn't really a river or a water town. Mm-hmm. There's not a big river running through it like there is the Yampa here, or like in Bend, which has the Deschutes, or Jackson, which has the Snake, or Durango, which has the Animus. All Boulder has is these tiny little creeks that funnel out of the Front Range. And I've actually thought about that. I think that would be a great book, is just the early years in Boulder, because there are so many wild tales from growing up there on the hill. Through the riots, through the university, through just stories of living in the 70s and what you could get away with, and that sort of thing that you can't these days. And a lot of that is what we could get away with on the river as well. Mm-hmm. I doubt you're seeing kids running around these days with as long a leash or no leash like we had.
Right.
Basically you're out just playing in the neighborhood, waiting for your mom to ring the dinner bell.
Exactly.
Which means come home. You know, and then basically we had 6 kids in our family, would all just come back from all over the neighborhood, to get dinner, and we always ate late, like 9 o'clock at night.
Okay.
We were the latest eaters in the whole neighborhood, I think. Which is something that I actually probably carried through to my own kids here in Steamboat. We always ate kind of late. Brooke and Casey, my daughters, were always like, Dad, how come we're always eating so late? I think it's just how I was raised, but also because, you know, you're out doing things, you know, you're working till 5 or 6, and that's when you want to go out and go kayaking or fly fishing or biking or do something, and then you're getting home by 7:38, and then you deal with dinner. So anyways, I digress. We're talking about our late dinners now instead of writing about myself. But you know, back to your question, writing about yourself. You know, I don't know. I've written a lot of first-person stuff. A lot of my other books are first-person. You know, Brothers on the Boschhaus was this trip we took to Russia, and we won a grant from Gore-Tex on, and to go run this river there. And so that was entirely a first-person. And on that one, I brought up a little of my river running background just to kind of paint the picture of how we ended up getting this grant and being there. This other book, Comrades on the Colca, was about running a big expedition in Peru, and you know, that's first person as well, interspersed with some historical chapters and whatnot. But this one was a little more personal because it's more about me and how I ended up here and why and that sort of stuff. So this one definitely went into more of that than any of these others did. The other book that did have a fair amount of first person stuff like that kind of put me out there a little bit was Outdoor Parents, Outdoor Kids, kind of a guide to getting your kids outside, which came out in, I believe, like 2011 or so. And that one was all about raising kids in the outdoors. So that wasn't me in my younger ages really, but me with my 2 kids. So I was a full-grown adult and just you know, writing about what it takes to raise your kids to appreciate the outdoors. Right, yeah. So you had to write about your family and be vulnerable in that one. Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned about yourself is the inspiration for this book, David James Duncan's My Story is Told by Water. David James Duncan is one of my favorite authors too, and I love how you reveal it in this book through your conversations with Jay Fetcher. What is it about that book in particular that, you know, fueled the inspiration for this book?
That's a good question. You know, it took me a while to get through his book because it goes into a lot of detail about the environment, ecology, all that sort of stuff, and him growing up on his streams of Montana and Oregon and the plight those rivers and the fish are facing. And I think it was about halfway through the book when I was reading that, the light bulb went off. That was, oh my God, I should do something like this on the Yampa. I mean, here he is getting people to care about the rivers in their own backyards through his writing, and he's a phenomenal writer. And I knew I could, you know, in no way kind of come close to what he pulled off. But it got me thinking, you know, I've been living along the Yampa for, you know, more than 3 decades. And it's got a good story to tell as well. You know, the last remaining free-flowing tributary to the Colorado system. I know it as well as anyone. You know, where Duncan's lens might have been more from a fishing perspective. You know, him and Norman McLean and all those guys are great fly fishers, and that's their lens that they kind of use to tell their stories. Mine happens to be, you know, paddling. But it doesn't really matter what your lens is, you know, when you're telling that story.
When is it that you read that book and got this inspiration?
I think I read that, you know, back in like right around COVID or before COVID.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, right around then. And that's I certainly didn't have the idea for this too much before I started diving into it. You know, so I actually started looking back at some of my emails, and you know, when I was thinking about it, and I think some of them dated back to like 2020 or 21, so probably about a 5-year process. I put it on the back burner for a bit. I mean, it's interesting the way it came out. I knew that I probably was going to want to self-publish it through I've been using this company Ingram Spark in Atlanta, and it's interesting. My first book, Brothers on the Boschhaus, is published by Fulcrum Publishing out of the Front Range, kind of a large independent publisher. And then after 10 years or so, the rights reverted back to me, or it went out of print.
Okay.
And so then I asked them if I could retain the rights to it, and they let me, and they said, yeah, they gave it to me. And they said, just, you know, you get a new ISBN number, you know, take all of our info out, and you can have it. So then I researched, you know, the self-pub game for that book and kind of learned the ropes and how that works. And, you know, it went pretty seamless with that. And so I did, Another one of my books that way, Tales from a Mountain Town, which came out I think in 2018 or so. And so that's what I kind of decided to do for this one too. And I've had publishers for like 3 of my books, and on this one I figured, all right, it might do well regionally. Is it going to make that big jump to being, sell well out in New York and all that? Maybe not. Which is what really I think publishers bring to the table. They got that broader reach.
Right.
But if it's just going to stay local, then I know the ropes of how to do it. By myself, so I decided to do that. At the same time, I realized, all right, I don't really want to go into this and then, dig myself a big hole financially and try to, dig my way out of that, relying on book sales. So a tactic I used with this Tales from a Mountain Town book, because I kind of sold sponsorship ahead of time, which worked pretty good for the Tales from a Mountain Town book, and on this one it did as well, to various non-profits like the Walton Foundation, Friends of the Yampa here in town, River Management Society, American Rivers. I mean, a pretty long list of supporters that were pretty eager and willing to jump on and help back it beforehand, which was great. So I guess full circle is, I started writing the book, and then I realized, well, I want to see if there's any sponsor support for it beforehand. So then I took a year or 2 off and didn't even address writing it at all, and I was just kind of drumming up sponsor support. And then once I found there was kind of a modicum of support for it, I was like, well, holy smokes, I better start writing this thing, because now all of a sudden I'm on the hook, and not like I had gotten any money yet, but I knew there was interest. And I was like, all right, I better stop trying to solicit sponsors and actually start writing this thing. So then I jumped back into that mode for a couple years. Where I was, all right, I better start cranking this out. And then once that was maybe 80-90% done, or I knew I had it done and it wasn't going to flake out, then I went back to the sponsorship table and kind of recontacted everybody and said, hey, remember me? Okay, it looks like it's a deal now. So and then so I went to that. So I kind of jumped back and forth between wearing my marketing hat and my writing hat.
Okay. And I really like how you included the sponsors at the end of the book, and that they're visible, and you mentioned them throughout. It's done very tastefully. Yeah,
and I want to make it worth their while, and a lot of them are great because they just want to get the message out there. Like a lot of the nonprofits, the Walton Family Foundation, American Rivers. I mean, that's their whole Friends of the Yampa. That's their kind of whole mission, is to educate people on waterways and other environmental aspects. And this was a great way for them to do that. I did apply for a grant that I thought I had a good chance of getting, but I didn't get. The watershed, I think it was a watershed grant out of the Front Range that was awarding money to projects that deal with issues related to the Colorado River system. It could be films, it could be books, it could be magazine stories. So I was like, all right, that'd be a great one. But I didn't get it, unfortunately, which is fine. But I did get enough other support that I was able to pull it off. So it came out just after Christmas, so literally started distributing early January. So that's great. It's doing so well locally. I think it's testament to, I guess, how much people appreciate the river here, and maybe help people not take it for granted. I mean, it's really easy to do. You have this river going through town, and you drive over it every day and you see it, and it kind of fades into the background, but now hopefully people can look at it with, to appreciate it a little more for what it is and what it all brings to this whole community and valley. So
definitely. Well, another thing that you reveal about yourself is that you do something special, or you try to do something special every year on your birthday. Happy belated birthday, by the way.
Thank you.
On the Yampa, and I'm curious what that was this year of all years.
This year I was lucky. It was actually I had a great birthday. I had kind of my birthday week, as my wife likes to call it. I had a good 4-day run of mountain biking, paddling. Had friends come up, and then on my actual birthday, which was Sunday this year, we went down and did Cross Mountain again. Which a lot of years you can't do it because it's too cold. I mean, it's a snowstorm, or the river is frozen over, or it's too low. This year, I mean, people had been running it for a couple weeks already, and the weather, was decent. It was probably 60, 70 degrees down there. So and I was a little, what was it flowing? About 1800 CFS. So, you know, relatively good, hefty level for your first time out, for dusting the cobwebs out of your boat and going down there. But yeah, I love getting out there and doing that, especially on my birthday, because when you're there just sitting in the bottom of a canyon, that's just a chronicle of time itself. Makes you feel kind of insignificant, you know, kind of like those astronauts that just got back from Artemis, you know, on Artemis. So
yeah. But speaking of astronauts, I saw the movie Project Hail Mary on Friday, and there's a scene, Ryan Gosling, the main character, and his buddy are working on a project. You know, they're sitting this far from each other, but they've bought walkie-talkies for the project, and they're talking to each other on the walkie-talkies. And then the next day, towards the end of your book, when you talk about, you know, running in like the luge chute on Bruce's trail with your buddy,
I remember that
you take, and you
that's
you said you guys did the same thing.
No, we did, and it's actually funny because I gave a talk at the library, and so I put a PowerPoint together, and in it I included a few video clips of some Yampa related activities I've done, and one of them was came up with this. You know, we like going skate skiing up on Rabbit Ears Pass, kind of this time of year in the spring when it turns to crust and you can just go anywhere.
Right.
And on one of those outings, I saw this river just bubbling up through the snow and then eating its way down through this passage. I think it's like, I don't know, it's up by Dumont somewhere. And so I was like, oh my gosh, you could kayak that thing, you know, but you got to get in there. It's a mile or two in there.
Right.
So it's like I came up with this way, you know, if I rig up these you know, handles of this ski patrol sled and attach them to the kayak and then to my waist belt, I could probably ski my kayak in there for a mile or two and then get out of the kayak or get out of my skate gear and get in the kayak and float this creek that had never been done before. I can't imagine anyone had ever paddled that thing. But I enlisted the help of a wingman, my friend Andy Bauer, and so he was kind of videoing it the whole way. We made a little, you know, dorky 2-3 minute video clip on it. Skate Yak, the movie, it's called. But on those, we did have the walkie-talkies, and on one of them, he was right next to me. And okay, I'm dropping in. Okay, Roger. Even though he was standing right next to me. It's not an expedition if you don't have walkie-talkies, as Ryan Gosling.
Where can we see Skate Yak?
That's I got a YouTube channel. Eugene Buchanan sits on there. You can find it. But yeah, so that was kind of fun. That's just another example of the kind of odd ways I've found to enjoy the watershed around here.
Right. The elephant in the room is that, you know, this book took on a more significant meaning this winter of all winters in a record low year. And not only that, I mean, a couple other things that struck me is that also this year, the Colorado River States Compact didn't get submitted. And then, you know, the Craig Power Station, which you talk about a few times, which was supposed to close on January 1st, has now twice been extended since then. I'd like you to comment on those three things, and, you know, how they take on extra significance this year of all years. And, you know, what else am I missing that is significant in a year like this?
Yeah, those are all very good points. You know, the timing was pretty good for the book. I mean, ideally, we all would like to have an average year or better. We always want that here when it comes to water flow. I mean, this book got put to bed back in, you know, September, I think, is when we did our final proofing and sent it to the printer and whatnot. So way before, and that was back when everyone's hopes were high for a great year. You know, and all the forecasts kind of showed that, it was probably have as good a chance to be average or better as not, you know, or when you're looking at Farmer's Almanac and that kind
it was
of
supposed
thing.
to be a La Nina year, right?
So, and then, you know, it started out slow and then stayed slow and then a storm or two, and then, you know, the book came out right when, you know, early January, when we had kind of below average, you know, October, November, and December leading up to it. And I've lived here long enough to know that when you have, you know, bad months like that before a season, you know, it's really hard to make up that ground later in the year, because even if we get an average January, average February, average March, that's not going to make up for a below average, October, November, December before it. You have to have an above average Jan, Feb, and March. And average years here are awesome. I mean, anytime our snowpack is average here, our average is a lot better than any other basin in the state.
Right.
Because they have lower averages than we do. So anytime we have an average year, it's like a great year for skiing, for ag, for rec, for the river, for everything. And I do have to say, I think we were due for a subpar season. I mean, we've had a string of great ones, the last 8 or 10 years of, all been great years.
Right.
Right around average or 90%. Or for a while I was saying, well, 90% is the new 100, and even 90% is great,
right.
So then if you have an 80% year, you're like, well, that's only 10% off 90%, so that's still a pretty good year. But never down in these kind of levels. Right now, I just looked today. I'm a nerd and geek about this stuff as I look at the snowtail sites every day as a paddler. And where are we at? Even after yesterday's rainstorm,
right.
It snowed and rained all day yesterday. What'd that do to the water content? And it moved up, I think, 1 percentage point from 23 to 24% of average now.
Okay.
So that's where we're at. So, fortuitous circumstance that the river happens to be on people's minds now more than it might have been on an average year. On an average year, they might just be taking it for granted again. And all right, the river's doing this thing, nothing to worry about. Going to water our lawns, going to do everything we always have. But now people are starting to think about it a little more, and maybe they're walking through a bookstore and seeing a title like this, Yampa Yearnings, and go, I wonder what that's about, and thumb through it, and maybe picking it up for that reason. So that said, the whole Colorado River issue, that's a coincidence again, but again, they've known that those deadlines were looming, for
right.
years, right?
Right?
And they just haven't too many, cooks in the room, and they're just not able to come to terms on how to divide up the Colorado's water. And as we all know, it's based on these historic assumptions that aren't there anymore, and haven't been there for 30 years, and we've been going in deficit spending and even more these years. And so there's all sorts of proposals and alternatives thrown out there, and getting everyone to agree on one is the hard part, especially when you're looking at the upstream states versus the downstream states. And I think the one that I like the best that I've heard is, rather than basing it on this historic average set from the 1920s, back when flows were way, way bigger than they are now, let's base it on the actual flows that are coming in to Lake Mead and Powell. And so if we have, a 60% of our runoff going into those reservoirs, then the downstream states get 60% of their allocated allotment, as do we. So it's kind of, you're using the water that is there and dividing that up rather than a kind of fictional amount that's not there. So, and they keep saying that, if the states can't come up with a solution on their own, then the feds are going to step in, and who knows what kind of solution, that might bring.
Right.
Certainly not one that's going to be as regionally focused or taking in the sympathies and the needs of the areas as well as the states
right.
can when they're looking after themselves. So, so that's kind of that take. And I'm sorry, what was the third?
The coal plant.
Oh, the coal
being
plant.
Extended.
Yeah. So, yeah, coal. That's just. Part of the Trump administration. Trying to, placate coal interests again.
Right.
Kind of topsy-turvy for the poor power plant people, because here they have been, planning all along and making these cuts and planning for a life after coal and a life after the power plant. And a matter of fact, driving down to Cross Mountain to go run that, ran it again this past weekend, and there's this whole big new, transformer power plant pole lines they put up pending the because of the potential shutdown.
Right.
And so now they've got those going because they know that power, that juice wasn't going to be coming into the system from there anymore, so they put a bypass in, and it goes right by where the turnoff is to Cross Mountain.
Okay.
And it used to be, to get to the put in across mountain, you would go past Maybell and take a right at the first tree. So the first tree after
Right.
Maybell. Now they have a sign there because they needed the workers to be able to get into their spot, and you can see the power
right.
lines and stuff. So and it's interesting. And I had a great time touring the Craig Power Station with Jackie Brown, and walked me through the whole thing. It was the first time I'd really been in there, and really appreciated everything it does, and how much it adds to the grid, and just the factor of coal being coal, but they do everything they can with scrubbers and everything that they can to make it as clean a contributor to the grid as they can. And the plant's right next to the coal field, so the coal doesn't have to travel far. They're a zero discharge plant when it comes to water use. They're the largest water right holder on the river, but they use it all, so they don't dump anything back into the river. Everything they pull out, they use. It goes to cooling. It goes to the tanks, which was interesting. And in some of my due diligence on that, it's interesting that the largest municipal user isn't any of these cities here either, Steamboat or Craig. It's this company, or it's this, I believe it's like Cheyenne, which gets water by pulling it out of the Little Snake up and way in North Route, way up in there. And the Little Snake is a tributary to the Yampa, so it feeds it. So it's still technically that drainage, but they pull out a higher water right than these cities have, which is interesting to find out. So,
besides the three things that you already commented on, are there any other like big obvious issues that are magnified in a year like this year?
I think one of the ones that it kind of puts, I guess, the Yampa in the headlights a little bit more, because it is a major contributor to the Colorado River Basin, and a lot of people, I think, didn't really appreciate that as much before. The Colorado River, has been kind of tapped and siphoned over the Continental Divide, to satisfy the Front Range, and yet it still has to, provide these rights for downstream and downstate users. And for me, in talking to a lot of people I interviewed about it, is, the Yampa could be a win-win for everybody. We have to satisfy these downstream water rights. So let's do that with the Yampa. Keep water in the Yampa, maintain its natural hydrograph, which it has and enjoys, which so many other rivers don't anymore, and let's use that water to, continue, replenishing our riparian zones and endangered fish and everything else ecologically that it's done all along, while also satisfying these downstream water rights. Let's not lose our water in this to get pulled somewhere else. Let's do that with the rivers that already have those that infrastructure in place.
Right.
And it's interesting in doing some of my research on this. There are diversions on the Yampa that take it out of our water basin, I've talked to a couple of folks who told me about some of these. They're up on Rabbit Ears, and another one over in the Flat Tops, but they don't take it over the Continental Divide. They take it to the Colorado system, so it still feeds the general Colorado system drainage. There's like one, I forget, it's like the Sarvis Creek one or whatever, Upper Sarvis Creek, that goes into Muddy Creek, right? And then Muddy Creek goes into the Colorado over by Kremlin. And there's another one in the Flat Tops that I think goes in towards Rock Creek or whatever, comes out of the the Yampa, some ditch, and it makes the move over the basin to Rock Creek and the Colorado side, but it still flows into the Colorado basin, which the Yampa does eventually as well too.
Right.
So it's keeping it in this pool.
Well, okay, this is a good segue, because one of the questions I had is, how is it that the Yampa still can be called a wild river, with the reservoirs and dams that are on it? And you do, like in good ways into the book, in chapter 18, there's a paragraph that defines it. It's on page 295. And what I take from that is, it's that paragraph there. What I take from that is that because we keep it in this basin, even with the dams and reservoirs. That's why we can still call it a wild river.
Yes, and I think more importantly than that is, it has these dams in it, right? Catamount, Stagecoach, Yamcolo. But in my talks with folks for this, really came to appreciate the fact that they're all so far up in the Yampa headwaters that they don't affect its natural hydrograph, right? You look at every creek that dumps into the Yampa, all the major ones come in below Catamount. So I mean, and Catamount's just a flow-through one anyways, right? It doesn't hold water back. So you start looking at all those, you got, Silver Creek, Morrison Creek, Sarvis Creek, Oak Creek, Walton Creek, Fish Creek, Spring Creek, Soda Creek, Butcher Knife Creek, the Elk River, Elk Head, all those rivers dumping into the Yampa below these dams. So those dams don't affect the natural hydrograph at all. The Yampa still gets up to 20,000 CFS on a big year, especially after the Little Snake and elk come into it, by the time it reaches the green out in Dinosaur, even if those dams are there. So even if those dams weren't there, it's still going to get up to that 20,000 CFS.
Okay.
So they're not holding back water, and if they are, it's the amount is so minute because it's so far up in the headwaters.
Okay.
When I talked to in the fishing chapter, I talked to my friend Kevin, who's a cutthroat, trout biologist here, and he said the Yampa has the highest stream density of any river in the state, and it's because all of those tributaries pour into it in such a short period. You look at between Stagecoach and the western side of Steamboat, there's 10 to 14 major creeks that all dump into the Yampa, just like boom, 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 boom. Walton Creek, Fish Creek, Soda Creek, Oak, all those ones I just mentioned, and all of those in big water years can get up to 1,000 CFS a piece. Let alone the elk, which gets up to like 8,000 CFS.
And there was something unique about the elk. Remind me, like it's the densest.
It is the has the most volume for the shortest length.
Okay.
Of any river in the country, which is Jay Fetcher kind of reiterated that. Man, I had heard about that, and I wasn't really able to go measure every single river in the country and tell the water volume or find any studies that did that. But Jay hangs his hat on that, and that's largely while their ranch is up there. And it was real interesting in the agriculture section, just getting a tour of his ranch and seeing how lush a valley the whole Elk Valley is up there.
Right.
And those ranchers like him, he said, in reality, they've never really had to worry about water. They have it so easy when it comes to water compared to most other ranches in this basin and other basins, because there's just always snowfall there up in the circles, and it always comes down there, and they're first in line to get it. But yeah, so for the elk, it gets higher than the Yampa does. The Yampa runs, 250 miles all the way from the flat tops to the green. The elk only runs about 30 miles. And the elk gets up to 8,000 CFS in that 30 miles, which is more than the Yampa gets up to. And it's, what would it be? Maybe, 50, 60 miles to get to the same point where the elk meets it.
Yeah.
So
you answered a couple of my questions I had in my notes. In your conversation with Jay, you talk about how even in drought years he does okay, and I was curious if you knew, if he's going to say something different this year.
Yeah, who's to say? This year is different than any year he's ever seen there. Probably different than most year his dad John probably ever saw there. Because we're kind of in a historic low right now. So, it's interesting driving out to Cross the other day. And you're seeing the fields, and irrigators are pulling their water and using it. They're a lot of years they might not be now because the soil might be wet already, or there might still be snow on there. But they're irrigating and pulling already, and I'm sure probably Jay is as well up there.
Right.
And he has, I forget if it was 10 or 15 different irrigation ditches coming off various different little creeks, and the stem of the elk, but all these little creeks that feed the elk. So. I mean, a lot of them probably aren't running right now. Those smaller creeks,
Right.
and they might not have really run. And so the elk might be the mothership that they're pulling from this year.
Mm-hmm. In your answer, when I asked you to talk about the significance of the low water year, you did indicate that there were cycles, and at one point in the book you talk about the river having mood swings, right, which is a metaphor for those cycles. And talk more about that a little bit, because I told myself this year, to make myself feel better, and I don't know if I'm lying to myself or not, that the fact that the Midwest and the Northeast were having above average snowfalls and cold temperatures kind of proves that things can be cyclical. But like I said, I may be lying to myself.
Yeah, and it's kind of, it's interesting how different areas of the country, do better some years than others, right? The Northwest might do good one year. New England has historically not done well over the last 5 or 10 years, where we have. So now it's kind of our turn, and I try to almost personify that in the river's perspective a little bit. Saying I'm sure the river's not happy with it right now. If you were gonna, if it had a pulse and a conscience, and we could tap it to ask it, how it's doing, it'd be like, well, I've had better years. I wish we had more water. And like people go through their ups and downs as well. A lot of times you gotta, play the cards that you're dealt, and meanwhile it just keeps chugging what cargo it does have downstream and doing what it can. And more importantly, the river probably feels bad for all the people that have come to rely on it for and what it brings to so many different aspects of life. Not just us humans and agriculture, which uses 80% of the water, but the riparian zones that it replenishes every year. Those unique zones in the dogwood, the redwood, the osiers and the cottonwoods and all that down in Carpenter Ranch, the endangered fish, that need those flush cycles, to restore cobble and that sort of thing for spawning. So I'm sure the Yampa, feels bad about not being able to do its part this year as well. So
a couple of things that I learned in reading this book that I thought were pretty cool were the section where you talk about the peregrine falcon recovery program, where they were switching out the eggs,
right,
and that was working. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
that was pretty cool. I didn't know that the original Coors logo was Fish Creek Falls. So I'm curious, in your research, what were some things that you didn't know about that are pretty cool?
Yeah, those two for sure. The Fish Creek Falls Coors logo, that was pretty cool. And and I found one of the old cans, and it does, looks
okay.
Yeah, you look looks
right.
Spit an image of it,
Right.
And then they've since changed it, to another fall somewhere. But the peregrine falcons story, I heard that on a river trip down in through Dinosaur, and so I looked into that a little bit and found out that kind of what a milestone that was, and the kind of the bird reintroduction scheme of things, and it worked great, and it was just a great spot for them to do that. Everything, there's all sorts of little tidbits like that I found out as well in looking. That stat on the elk was a pretty impressive
right.
one. Everything from the Yampa's name to indigenous use and all that. And one thing I didn't go into as much is that latter, is indigenous use of it. The Utes and the Fremont downstream and all that. But they relied on the river every bit or more than we did. So, well, I tell you, and that was one of the interesting parts of the research for this, was going through those 3x5 note cards from John Fetcher that Jay gave me, and he gave me these just piles of manila envelopes saying, well, here, you can take these and these boxes of his notes, and going through them. And that guy was just the water czar in the valley, and he had little ditties like that, like all 5 of those. And he would lead off all his speeches with, some of those little quips, and just how involved he was in water in this whole area and realizing its importance. And he might be rolling over in his grave right now to see a year like this.
Right.
And it'd be interesting to see. Well, he might be saying, "Well, I told you so. That's why I started building all these things."
Right. Right.
You're because he was behind Steamboat Lake and Stagecoach and Fish Creek Res expansion, and so he kind of saw the writing on the wall, I think, and trying to make eventualities for years like that.
Well, I want to thank you, Eugene, for taking the time to do this. You've proved in writing this book and talking about the things that you do on the Yampa, for the Yampa, that you're doing it. And one thing that particularly struck me is that in your fishing chapter, you talk about how, you're not a great fisherman, but it just gets you out there and appreciating the river. And I think that's something that everyone should take to heart. Is there anything else that you feel is important to cover?
No, I would say just, everyone get out there, especially this year, give a river a second glance next time you drive over it, and appreciate what it's doing, and get out there and enjoy it. You don't have to be out on it or fishing on it if we have a closure this year, which we likely will, sooner rather than later probably. You can still go out and sit by it, and listen to its lap on the shore, and then have it soothe your soul.
All right. Well, thanks, Eugene.
All right, thanks for having me.